We are live.
Okay, great. So hello and welcome to this evening. So we'll be starting properly just in a couple of minutes. So if you'd like to say hello in the chat box, that'd be very nice. I think we've had a hello from Kevin already.
Yeah.
Who else have we got?
We've got Paul saying hi from Brighton.
Paul from Brighton. Hello, hi.
And Anna from Cambridge. Got Maggie from Stoke Newington.
So hi, Anna and Maggie.
And we've got 35 people at the moment online, so people are just tuning in.
Great. So people are just arriving. So I've got in the room with me two of the guys I live with. So David, who's doing the tech, and Amla Yodin, our soon-to-be new Mitra convener, one of our new Mitra conveners to be. So that'll be happening on Saturday. So yeah, it's very nice to have them both with me. So yeah, so I'm Paramabandhu, for those of you who've not met me before. And yeah, just very nice to be with you this evening and to think about thinking. So we got any more hellos?
Yes, we've got Tom Gibson from Glasgow.
Hi, Tom from Glasgow.
Stefan from Bow.
Hi, Stefan, locally from Bow.
Got Nikki and Aryadara saying hello.
Oh, hi, Nikki and Aryadara.
Mark Shackstead from Stephanie. And then we've got Elizabeth from Mexico.
Ah, buenas tardes, Elizabeth from Mexico. Well, for you, it's probably the morning, but that's great. That's very good. Okay, great. So let's make a start. So yes, so I'm Paramabandhu. We're doing the path to full potential, and I'll just say what we're going to be doing tonight. So we're still on, or this part of it is still part of the first stage, which is the stage of ethics or sila. We've been doing meditation in the morning, and tomorrow we'll start looking at wisdom. So what I'll be doing is I'll be talking about thinking, and then we'll have a meditation, a short meditation. Then we'll have a tea break, and after that I'll say some more about thinking, and then there'll be an opportunity to ask questions, and you can just put those in the chat box, and David will collect them. Great, good. So so my title is that I was given is How to Think. So well, I was thinking about meditation. I don't know if you've had this experience of sitting in meditation and having what I call the tumble dryer mind, which is the mind that goes round and round and round and round. You can put a yes in the chat box if that's familiar, if anyone's familiar with that. I imagine one or two of you probably are. You got any yeses there? So yeah, it's quite common, isn't it, that when we're meditating, we start, it can be a bit of a surprise when we first start meditating how many thoughts that we can find go on in our mind. And there was a study that was done about 10 years ago by Killingsworth and Gilbert, and they used an iPhone app to ask people about their thinking. So what they did is they took over 2,000 adults, and they randomly contacted them and asked them two questions, which was, first of all, how are you feeling right now? And secondly, are you thinking about something other than what you're doing right now? So the results of this little study was that they found that people said, yes, they were thinking about something other than what they were doing 47% of the time. So nearly half of the time, people were thinking about something other than what they were doing. And in all activities, except for one, which I'll mention in a moment, at least 30% of the time, they were thinking about doing something else. The one exception, according to the study, was when people were making love. And I don't think they meant doing the metabhavana by that. So yeah, a lot of the time they found that people were thinking about other things. And what they discovered is that when people were thinking about something other than what they were doing, they tended to be less happy. So quite an interesting little study. And this was one of the times when particularly people found that there was particularly high results for thinking about something other than what they were doing, and it for being not very pleasant, was when people were working. It's quite interesting. Again, so we're busily working and our mind goes off, but it's actually not very pleasant. So obviously there's a bit of an issue there, isn't there? We've got this is what our minds do. Our minds have this tendency to think about other things, and it doesn't seem to necessarily lead to our happiness. So what should we do about thinking? Well, fortunately, the Buddha's got a lot to say about thinking. So I thought what I'd do this evening is I'm going to look at 3 suttas from the Buddhist scriptures. There are 3 that happen. They're consecutive suttas from those of you who like your Pali references. They're from the Majjhima Nikaya, that's the middle-length sayings, and they are suttas 18, 19, and 20. So but you don't have to remember that, but just if you like that sort of thing. So I'm going to look at those 3 suttas to look at what the Buddha had to say about thinking. I'm going to look at the middle one first, so number 19, which is called 2 Kinds of Thought. So in this, the Buddha is describing his experience before he was enlightened. And in the commentaries, it says it's the 6th year of his struggle to gain enlightenment. So he'd already been practicing for some time when apparently this happened. And what he decided to do was to identify 2 sorts of thoughts, 2 kinds of thoughts, and put one set on, as it were, on one side and the other set on the other side. So the first set of thoughts were thoughts that were associated with sense desire, with ill will, and with cruelty. So that was the first set of thoughts. Maybe a bit surprising that the Buddha, not so long before he's enlightened, had thoughts of cruelty, but anyway, seemingly that was the case. And then the other set of thoughts were in a way the opposites of that. So thoughts to do with renunciation or letting things go, giving things up, thoughts to do with metta or loving kindness, and thoughts to do with compassion. So first of all, he identified these thoughts and put them on each side respectively, sort of in his mind. And then he also noticed the effects. So he noticed what the effects were of these 2 types of thoughts. So the first type of thoughts, the ones to do with sense desire and aversion, he noticed that they led to him suffering and led to other people suffering. He noticed that they obstructed wisdom, that they caused difficulties, and that they led away from enlightenment. I had a little question in my mind about whether he could know that, as he wasn't enlightened at that point, but maybe that was retrospectively he realized that it was leading away from enlightenment. And then the other set of thoughts, the thoughts to do with renunciation, to do with metta and compassion, he noticed that those did not lead to suffering either for himself or other people, that they actually supported or aided wisdom, that they didn't produce difficulties, and that they led towards enlightenment. So what have we got going on here? So the first thing, if we're going to be thinking about thinking, or how to think about thinking, is to notice what's going on. So to identify what sort of thoughts we've got going on in our minds. Now, fortunately, we get loads of opportunity to practice that if we meditate. I mean, actually not just if we meditate, but particularly if we meditate. So you know what it's like. You start doing the mindfulness of breathing, you put your mind on the breath, and within moments, you're thinking about something else. So the sort of thing that, in a way, I was describing this study at the beginning, that, you know, you think your plan is to focus on the breath, but actually your mind goes somewhere else. And of course, it's very easy, I think, particularly when you're new to meditation, but actually on a subtle level, even when you're not so new to meditation, to get frustrated by the mind wandering off in that way. But actually, we needn't do that. I mean, it's for obviously it's counterproductive to get frustrated, but we needn't do that. We can actually see it's a really, really good opportunity to examine what is going on in our mind. So in other words, to see where does our mind want to go and what sort of thoughts have we got going on. So, you know, have we got thoughts of ill will, or have we got thoughts of kindness? So we can sort of notice that. We can start to notice what our particular preoccupations are, the particular places that our minds like to go. So, for example, my own mind just loves to plan. This was something that I discovered very early in my meditative career. So, for example, you know, years ago when I was first learning to meditate, and I was a medical student at the time, and I found I kept thinking again and again about what I was going to say in my interview for my first main job in psychiatry. Now, you know, arguably that's not a bad thing to do, that, you know, one needs to, you know, think about one's, you know, if you're applying for a job, you need to think about, you know, what you're going to say about it. Now, the only thing about this is this interview that I had in mind was not due to take place for another 2.5 years. So it was kind of like a little bit too soon to be thinking about that. But anyway, it just, to me, in a way, it just illustrated how much my mind liked to plan. So anticipate what I was going to be doing in the future and, in a way, manage it. So we can start to see what are our preoccupations, what does our mind like to do. And then we can notice, well, what are the effects on our mind or on us of the thoughts that once we've identified them. So does it lead to suffering or does it not lead to suffering? So again, coming back to the example of planning. So when I notice that when my mind is in a planning frame of mind, there might not be a sort of gross form of suffering, but I'll notice probably there's a little bit of tension somewhere. So it's like it's because there's a sort of anticipation into the future. And also, you know, one of the things about planning, certainly in my own psyche, is to do with wanting to control the future. So wanting to control things that aren't completely in my control creates a certain kind of tension. So again, I can sort of just notice that, oh, actually, this leads to a certain kind of suffering. Same thing when we, you know, sense desire, when we, you know, our minds get taken up with wanting something. Again, easy to not notice the suffering in that, because if our minds are taken up with sense desire, tends to be what we focus on is how lovely it would be to get this object and what are the attractive aspects of this object, whether that's, you know, a chocolate or a person that we want, or, you know, whatever it is, a new car or new object or something or other. whatever it is that our mind takes hold of, we focus on the sort of the outcome, which can seem pleasurable. But actually, if we pay a deeper attention, we can notice that there's actually a tension there as well, because, well, it's not in our hands right now. And so there's, again, this sort of leaning into the future, as it were. Conversely, we might have, a thought of gratitude enters our mind. Maybe somebody's given us a little present or something like that, and that comes to mind. And though we can notice that actually that appreciation, that gratitude doesn't cause suffering, actually leads to a more expansive effect on our mind, on our body. So yes, in this way, we can look at what are the effects of our thoughts on our mind. We can also notice, does it help, does it support, or does it obstruct wisdom? And in a way, what's been got at here, I think, is does this kind of thinking, do these thoughts lead to a sort of clear mind or to a more clouded, confused mind? So, for example, it said that, when we get angry, we're stupid. I don't know if you've ever noticed that. But it's like in the heat of anger, it's very hard to think clearly. Or we might have a very narrow sort of tunnel of thinking in terms of, wanting to destroy the object of our ire, as it were. But it's certainly not a very broad mind, broad clarity. Similarly with, if we're practicing, for example, a compassion meditation, and we're trying to cultivate compassion. If we're really in tune with the compassion, that has a very sort of clear, almost like a deep stream quality about it. So it's sort of open and expansive and clear. But again, that can slip if we get too caught up in the thoughts about the suffering. That we can get, that can go into a bit of a sort of a feeling of being overwhelmed. And then in a way, we're slipping off true compassion into something that's a bit like it, but it's not the real thing, which is then a bit cloudier. So again, we can just sort of notice how our thoughts and the emotions that go with them are affecting our mind, whether it leads to a clear mind or not. And again, this can be, quite subtle, like in the example of the compassion. It can start clear and then it starts to go a bit muddy because we sort of slip off what we were trying to do or what we were initially in contact with. So, in this same sutta, the Buddha said, having first of all talked about identifying thoughts, noticing the effect on them, he comments that the other thing that he noticed, again before he's enlightened, is that whatever you frequently think about and ponder upon will become the inclination of your mind. Whatever you frequently think about and ponder upon will become the inclination of your mind. In other words, what if we keep thinking about something, it's kind of like we feed that thought. Or put it the other way around, if we feed that thought by giving it attention, it will tend to grow. And our mind will come back to it again and again. I don't know, again, if you've probably noticed that, again, you can get this thing in meditation where you just keep, the same thing keeps coming around and you keep getting caught up in it and maybe put it down for a moment. But actually, you've already given it quite a lot of energy. And so, again, it comes back. So we want to, in a way, sort of learn to distinguish between identifying a thought on the one hand and feeding it. So in a way, both are using, to some extent, are using thoughts. So we can identify a thought like, oh, look, I'm doing a planning thought, or I can get caught up in the planning and thinking about, oh yeah, but have I thought about that? And that would be a really good thing. And oh, there's that thing to think about as well. And off the mind goes. So all that is in a way feeding the thought. So we need to, in a way, distinguish between the two. And I'll say more about how we work with our thoughts after tea. But just one more thing from this sutta, which is, in a way, just pointing out that if our mind is caught up in unwholesome thoughts, it can be quite a lot of work to work with our thoughts. And the Buddha gives quite a nice little analogy. So he says it's a bit like a cowherd who's looking after his or her cows, and it's in the last month of the rainy season when the crops are growing and very full. So basically, you've got all the crops growing, you've got the cow herd, and what the cow herd has to watch out for is that the cows don't trample across and munch all the crops. So what it says in the sutta is that the cow herd has to constantly prod and poke the cattle. In other words, to keep them off. So it has to keep a really close eye on it, eye on the cattle. Whereas in the last month of the dry season, when the crops have all been harvested, they've all been taken in, the cow herd can just sit at the root of a tree and just sort of kind of hang out there and kind of enjoy it, and just keep check that the cows are still somewhere around. But they can, in a sense, just let them wander. And he said this is a bit like when you're in a positive, in your wholesome state of mind. So you can relax a bit more. So in a way, what it's pointing to is that when we are taken up with unhelpful and unskillful thoughts, we may need to put a bit more energy, and we may need to be a bit more on the case. But when our mind is in a more wholesome state, when we have some feelings of metta or kindness or generosity or calmness or contentment, we can just let go a bit more. So there's something there about learning the right sort of effort that we need to work with our thoughts. There are times when we need to put in quite a bit of effort, but if we then put the same amount of effort at other times, that will actually just disturb the mind rather than help us to open up and expand and relax more into those skillful states. Okay, so let's look a bit more at how we feed the mind. And I'm going to look at that through the previous sutta in this little collection of 3 suttas. And this is one called the Honeyball Sutta. So in this sutta, it starts with somebody called Dandapani. So Dandapani literally means stick in hand. Danda is stick, pani is hand. And apparently he's called this because he had a golden stick which he liked to wave around in a rather ostentatious way. And he used this stick even though he was young and healthy. In other words, so it's a kind of like a stick for show and maybe to poke in people's faces, who knows. Anyway, Dandapani went up to the Buddha and asked the Buddha, what did he assert? What did he proclaim? And you sort of get the feeling that what was going on here is Dandapani was sort of, in a way, looking for a fight with the Buddha. He wanted to have a nice argument with the Buddha where no doubt he would come out best. I don't know if you've ever had that experience of when you've sort of slightly felt yourself, sometimes we do it in a bit of an unconscious way, where we're sort of, scrapping for a fight or, sort of getting ready, we actually want an argument with somebody. Maybe you haven't experienced that mental state, and that's wonderful if you haven't, but it's not uncommon. Anyway, the Buddha clearly recognized what was going on, and he said this to Dandapani. Friend, I assert and proclaim my teaching in such a way that one does not quarrel with anyone in the world, in such a way that perceptions no longer underlie the Brahmin who abides detached from sensual pleasures, without perplexity, shorn of worry, free from craving for any kind of being. Anyway, it seems Dandapani wasn't too impressed by this. It seems like he couldn't, it didn't give him a way in to get into an argument. Maybe he didn't completely understand what the Buddha said, but also this comment from the Buddha about, I don't teach in such a way is basically to provoke argument. So Dandapani shakes his head, he clicks his tongue, and he raises his eyebrows, he puckers his eyebrows, and then he goes off. And that's the last we hear of him. So we don't know what, anyway, he didn't get his fight that he wanted. But the Buddha's disciples were clearly intrigued by what the Buddha had said to Dandapani and said, so how do you teach in such a way that doesn't provoke quarrel and doesn't do these other things? And the Buddha responded to them, saying something like, if you find nothing to delight in, welcome and hold to in the perceptions and notions that beset you, you will have the end of the underlying tendency to craving and other underlying tendencies, and you will have the end of taking up rods and weapons, quarrels, brawls, disputes, recrimination, malicious words, and false speech. So you won't get all those things. Now, all this may not be completely clear to you, and if it's not, you're in good company, because it wasn't completely clear to the disciples of the Buddha either. They sort of like, okay, they'd asked the Buddha this, and they still weren't clear, but the Buddha went off. So they were obviously looking at each other, wondering what to do, and they thought, oh, I know, let's ask Kachana, let's ask Mahakachana what the Buddha meant. So off they trot to go and see Mahakachana and said, this is what happened. What does the Buddha mean? And the Mahakachana says, well, you could have just asked the Buddha. It's like, you had the horse in front of you, as it were. But anyway, they push him and he explains. So what he explains is that in a way, what we can see is that there's a sort of sequence that goes on in our minds that can lead, if it's not checked, eventually to getting into fights and quarrels and brawls and so on. And so the sequence that Mahakachana explained goes like this. So first of all, we have contact with a sense object. So we see something. There's a coming together of the fact that we have a sight, the fact that there's an object to see, and that our consciousness is attending to it. So there's what's called contact. So there's contact between the object and our sense consciousness. And that contact, that sight, will, or any other sort of sensory modality, will have a feeling tone. It'll be pleasant or unpleasant or neutral. And that will tend to co-arise with a perception. So, I notice, oh, look, there's somebody looking at me right now, which is David, who's doing the tech. So what I notice is that I'm speaking from time to time. David smiles, as he is doing now. And that creates a pleasant Vedana in me, a pleasant feeling tone. And it goes with this perception of, oh, look, here's David smiling. That's nice. And on the basis of that feeling, tone, and perception, we start thinking. So, as I said, my immediate thought was, oh, that's nice, David's paying attention, and he's smiling, so that's good. Now, what can then happen is that we then go into a mental proliferation. So in other words, the thoughts can expand from there, and they will tend to get fed by underlying tendencies. So underlying tendencies to, for example, to craving, to aversion, to conceit. There are various lists of underlying tendencies. So, I might have an underlying tendency to, I want people to like me. So that comes into, me having this perception of David smiling and thinking, oh, that's great. Oh, he seems to like what I'm saying. That's fantastic. Oh, maybe he likes me. And, oh, that's really good. And so I start thinking, oh, well, I must make sure we go out for a coffee again. We haven't been for a coffee for a while. And so my mind proliferates in that way. And then on the basis of proliferation, we start forming, well, what's referred in the text as perceptions and notions that beset one. But maybe a way of talking about that more easily would be to think of it as like stories and narratives that we tell ourselves. So we have these habitual stories and narratives that we tell ourselves, even ideologies that we sort of subscribe to on a conscious or unconscious level. And then these in turn, these stories will influence how we experience newly arising sense experience. So to give you another example, I'll give you an example from my latest obsession, which is the obsession for African violets. My friends who know me know I'm completely obsessed with plants. I like plants generally. However, I had a story or a worldview, if you like, about African violets, which was that really these are just plants for old ladies. It's the sort of thing you'd give your grandmother or your great aunt, something like that. No, I hope no offense if there are any older ladies listening. It's not meant to be offensive, but it was kind of like I was not, drawn to these predominantly pink and purple flowers as I experience them, even though I'm completely obsessed with plants. So I got this view about this sort of narrative around African violets as these are for older people, they're nothing to do with me. However, so that meant that if I tend to be, in a garden centre where there's plants, I tend not to look at the African violets. They just, oh, well, they're for old people. Don't look at those. However, a couple of years ago, a friend took me very kindly to the Chelsea Physic Garden, and we had a look around the garden. And then at the end of the garden, they've got a little shop where they're selling plants. So we have a little sense experience there of I see plants, perception of plants, and that creates a pleasant Vedana. And a thought pops into my mind, which is fed by the underlying tendency of craving, which is, oh, it'd be really nice to take away a little plant as a souvenir. This is a rationalization, a souvenir of this little trip to the Chelsea Physic Garden. So I looked around the various plants and there wasn't anything I'm particularly drawn to, but I noticed these white African violets, and it was suddenly like I saw them freshly. So it's like, in a way, it was a bit like, for a moment, I let go of my idea about African violets and just saw this rather smart white African violet with these lovely glossy green leaves and thought, oh, that's rather nice. I think I'll buy that. So off I trot with my African violet. So I managed to put aside my normal narrative, but the other underlying tendency came in of craving for plants, and off I go with my plant. Now, what happened next is that, so I grew the plant for a while. It was in flower at the time, but then I found it very difficult to get it to flower again. So I did some reading, and just before lockdown, discovered that probably what it needed was more light. And in my bedroom, I happened to have a little sort of cabinet with some fluorescent growing lights for plants. So I thought, oh, well, I could try it in there. And so again, you could see an idea forming, and a new sort of mental proliferation starting to be created. Again, from sort of looking at this plant, thinking, oh yeah, it would go quite well in there with the grow lights, and that gives a looking at it in there is already a pleasant sensation. I thought, oh, it could do really well there. In comes the underlying tendency of craving, and my mind starts to proliferate and think, oh, well, maybe I could have some more African violets. And so I remember my favorite houseplant nursery online and think, oh, it's lockdown. I'm going to be in London for quite a while now. So I could just order myself as a little treat. So we have a little rationalization comes in there, some African violets. And so lo and behold, I fill my cabinet with African violets. And my sort of narrative changes from these are plants for old people to actually these are really exciting and interesting plants, because you can get all sorts of different varieties. You can get like ones with what are called fantasy colouring in the petals, and you can get little fringed petals, and you can get single and double ones, and you can get different colours. And anyway, so it goes on. And that's probably enough on African violets, but hopefully it gives you a bit of a sense of the sort of thing that can happen. Now, in the text, it's particularly looking at how, when we get into those fixed narratives and stories, it can lead to conflict, it can lead to fighting and brawls and malicious speech and all the rest of it. So probably my example is not one that's particularly going to do that, although it would only be a short step further when I start deciding that, oh, actually, I think I'm going to start building shelves in the living room with grow lights, and other people that I live with might have different feelings about having, shelf after shelf of African violets on the wall. Anyway, fortunately, I'm not going to do that, so the people in the room here can sigh with relief. But you can sort of see how I could, I hold on to that sort of view of this is a really good thing. It'd be really great to, have a whole wall full of them, and other people might have a different point of view. We already have this on the balcony where, from my perspective, if we've got a fantastic garden on our rather small balcony, other people's perspective is there's not enough room for the humans, and can we get rid of some of those plants that get in the way? So again, sort of two different conflicting set of storylines, which could, so far haven't led to the taking up of rods and weapons, but potentially could. So in a way, I'm doing this in quite a light-hearted way, but you could see how, if you think of all the conflict that we do have in the world, whether that's on a macro scale or just on a micro scale in terms of our individual relationships, how we can build up those storylines and narratives that we hold on to, which can create trouble for us. So, in a way, there's 2 points that I just want to make from this. So one is, first of all, this thing of we have this thing of these underlying tendencies. So one of the things that we need to watch out for is situations in which these underlying tendencies can be triggered. So, if I, so again, just coming back to the African violets, on the one hand, if I just pay bare attention to the violets, I can just enjoy them, and that's great. I can even read about them to learn a bit better about how to look after them. But I have to watch out for for example, last night when I was reading a book, and I was reading about the American African Violet Society that produces a twice monthly or bi-monthly magazine, and I'm starting to think, underlying craving for plants comes in, and I'm starting to think, oh, maybe I could get or subscribe to that magazine, and da, 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 da. So again, the craving gets fed. So what we want to do is try and notice how these underlying tendencies come in, so that we can start to be a bit more careful with our thinking to notice what, when that happens, so that we notice when we have to be careful with what's going on in our mind. And then the second thing is just to notice the whole sequence, and in particular, because we're talking about thinking today, to notice how, in a way, a simple thought of something can lead into a whole mental proliferation, that the whole thing just sort of snowballs. So again, it's really good to start to be able to identify the starting point, the simple thought that leads into that proliferation, and to see if we can move back to the thought instead of feeding the proliferation. So let's have a go at that just now. So we'll have a period of meditation. So we'll do a period of the mindfulness of breathing, just for 20 minutes. And what we can do is particularly notice what sort of thoughts are in our mind. So notice what the thoughts are. Notice the effect they have on us. And see if we can notice the move from a simple thought into mental proliferation. So there's 3 things that we can do. So let's have a go at that. So I'll mark 4 stages for the mindfulness of breathing. If you're not familiar with the mindfulness of breathing, just follow your breath. So just pay attention to the breath going in and out of the body. And when your mind wanders off, just noticing where your mind goes to. Okay, so I'll just lead us in with a little bit of body awareness. So a lot of thought, a lot of talking there. So we can just have a sense of our awareness dropping into the body. Letting your eyes closed unless you're sleepy. And just feeling the contact with the ground. And the contact with the cushions or chair or whatever else is supporting your body. And a sense of the body being upright, without straining. And then just tuning into our breath. And mindfulness of breathing. So, bringing the meditation to a close in your own time. And in a moment, we'll have a little break. You might want to write in the chat box if you've managed to notice any thoughts or the effects on you, or move into mental proliferation. And just to mention, if you were wondering why it's called the Honeyball Sutta, I mean, I used to think it was called that because our minds can get so sticky and tangled. But actually, it's what happens is at the end of the sutta, Ananda says, oh, that was such a good teaching. It was just like a hungry man who's given a honey ball, which is kind of like a cake or sweetmeat made of ghee and honey and flour. And it's just like a hungry man, and any part of the honey ball that he eats will taste really good. So just like same way with that teaching, every bit of it tasted really good. Anyway, that brings us time for tea and honey balls if you got them. Otherwise, just a little break and we'll start again at 8:10. Okay, great. So we'll just be starting in a moment. So hope you had a nice little break, do whatever you needed to do. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at the third sutta now, which is particularly looking at how to work with our thoughts. So this sutta is called the removal of distracting thoughts. Now, before we go into it, I think I need to give a little health warning, which is to say it's very easy to get the wrong end of the stick. What I mean by that is it's, we hear something like removal of distracting thoughts, and we immediately start worrying about our distracting thoughts and think we have to get rid of them, and then get frustrated when they keep appearing or feel a failure because they don't disappear. Clearly, all of that is really, really unhelpful. Our thoughts are going to be, around. We're thinking beings. We will think. We will have thoughts, and we will have thoughts in meditation. So it's much more thinking about how we creatively respond to our thoughts. And rather than thinking of removing, although that's what the sutta is called, I think it's better to think almost like of quietening, sort of allowing our thoughts to quieten rather than removing. And, again, we're talking, when it's saying about removing distracting thoughts, it's basically talking about removing unskillful thoughts, thoughts that don't help, thoughts that cause us suffering. Okay. So with that little health warning, let's go and have a look at the sutta. In this sutta, the Buddha talks to his disciples about 5 different ways of removing distracting thoughts. And again, just to emphasize, the thoughts we're talking about are thoughts associated with greed or craving, thoughts associated with ill will or aversion, and thoughts associated with delusion or spiritual ignorance or lack of clarity. So the first thing that the Buddha suggests is that we shift our attention onto a skillful thought. So we make a deliberate move from attending to an unskillful thought onto a skillful thought. So, for example, if we've got thoughts to do with ill will, we bring to mind some kind of metaphor thought, some kind of thought of kindness. Or if we're experiencing craving, sense desire for something, we might start to think about the impermanent nature of whatever it is that we crave. So we might still have the same object in mind, but thinking at it from a different angle. In a way, the same one with the ill will. We might have the same object or person in mind, but we shift our attention onto cultivating loving kindness. And with all of these 5 ways, the Buddha gives an analogy, and the analogy he gives is like a carpenter who wants to get rid of or knock out a thick peg using a fine peg to knock it out. So the fine peg being a skillful thought to knock out or displace an unskillful thought. So that's the first thing that the Buddha suggests. The second one that the Buddha suggests is, and in a way they're sort of sequential. So what he says is, if that doesn't work, you've still got thoughts of ill will, craving, etc., then you try this. And the second thing is to examine the danger of the thought. So this is a bit like what I was talking about earlier on in the first sutta, which is to notice how these sort of thoughts can cause ourselves suffering. And that might be on quite a subtle level. It might just be a little bit of tension somewhere in the body that we notice. It might not be, but on the other hand, it might be more obviously that it's causing us a lot of grief and distress. So it can be anywhere in that spectrum. But also, the Buddha suggests that not in examining the danger, we should also look at it from the point of view of, here we are trying to practice the Dharma, and in a way it's sort of unworthy of us. It's reprehensible to have these sort of thoughts. Now, again, clearly we have to do this in this is not an opportunity to beat ourselves with a stick, because that would just be adding fuel to the fire. But I think it's possible to have a positive pride, shall we say, in being a Dharma practitioner. That this is something that's important to me. This is something that I want to live up to. Like I really believe in metta, in loving kindness. It's something that I want to bring more to the world. And here I find myself sitting in meditation or in some other situation, and I'm just vibing ill will, and think that's really not what I want to be doing. That's not how I want to be living my life. And the Buddha gives again an analogy for this, and he says it's like a young man or young woman who is fond of ornaments, so someone who likes to dress up nicely, and somebody puts the carcass of a snake or a dog or a human around their neck. And of course, they would recoil with horror and disgust at that. So again, we're rather strong metaphor from the Buddha. And again, we have to watch out that we don't take this the wrong way. But maybe what this points to is, as we get increasingly sensitive to the effects of certain thoughts on our mind, we can just sort of have this sort of sense of, oh, no, that is actually quite unpleasant. I don't want to be engaging this sort of thought. And if we have that sort of response, that might be enough for us to let the thought go. So again, this is something else that we can try. Now, the next one, so if that doesn't work, the Buddha suggests that we can try and forget the thought and not give it attention. So again, we need to, be careful about what's being got at here. So again, it's not a question of trying to push a thought away. We're not pushing thoughts away. That doesn't work. That's a bit like, you've got a beach ball and you're in a swimming pool and you try and push the ball underwater. It'll just it bounces back up. So if we try and push thoughts away in that way, it's just not going to work. But in a way, what this is not giving it attention, not giving it energy. The analogy that the Buddha gives here is it's like someone who doesn't want to see something, and they close their eyes or they turn away. They look in another direction. This particular method I actually find is quite good for getting to sleep. So a little surprise from one of my people in the room here. So what I notice is I'm like lying, and I find that I've got my mind is quite busy, and that's occupying me. In a way, I don't want to. The thing about the first two methods is, in a way, they could be also quite busy, and what I want to do is to allow my mind to quieten. So I find that if I just don't give the thoughts attention, which for me usually means what I do instead is pay attention to body sensations and just keep, and in a way, just trying to do that in a calm, patient way, then eventually what I find is the thoughts will go. I'm not feeding them. In a way, that's the point. It's this thing of learning how not to feed thoughts that that aren't helpful, that we don't want. So I find that's generally works quite well for me in terms of if I'm struggling to get to sleep, to not give attention in that way. So what do we do if that doesn't work? Well, what the Buddha says as a fourth one is to inquire into the causes and conditions that led to the thinking coming about. So we can track back to where the thought came from. So sometimes as you start getting more, practiced in meditation, you can sort of start to notice how, you're suddenly thinking about C, and you suddenly go, oh, wait a minute, I was thinking about B a moment, and that's because I had a thought about A. You can sort of, in a way, start to track it back. So again, just a little example. You might find yourself thinking about what I'm going to do after meditation, and maybe your mind gets getting caught up in that. And if you track it back, maybe what you notice is that actually there's quite a lot of restlessness. You're feeling quite restless. And if you track that back, maybe you notice that actually there's some discomfort in the body somewhere. And maybe, earlier on you'd clocked actually there was a bit of discomfort, but you thought, oh, no, it's all right, it's not a problem, and sort of kind of ignored it. But on some level, that was then feeding restlessness. And then that was then feeding these thoughts about, basically get me out of the meditation. What am I going to be doing after the meditation? So it's a bit like what can happen is we keep finding a certain set of thoughts coming into our mind, like in this example, thoughts of what I'm going to do after meditation. And it's a bit like if you imagine a theatre which has got curtains, the curtains of a theatre, and what you can see on stage is this thought about what am I going to do after meditation. But what you can't see, because they're off stage, is the restlessness and the physical discomfort. And it's a bit like they're pinning this actor who's what am I going to do after the meditation? They're just pinning it on the stage. And in a way, what we have to do is try and peel back the curtains, open the curtains a bit more to see what's holding the thought in place. So again, that's another approach we can do. We can try and, in a sense, it's sort of try and either remember how it's arisen or just sort of notice more broadly what is going on, so that we, as it were, open the curtains a bit wider and can try and see what's holding in place this thought. And the analogy is given here is someone who's walking fast and says to themselves, oh, why am I walking fast? I could just walk slow. And then they walk slow. And then they say, oh, why am I walking at all? I could just stand still. Or then, oh, why am I standing still? I could just sit down. Or why am I sitting? I could just lie down. I don't know if you ever had that thought. That'd be great, wouldn't it? Just lie down. And anyway, what the suggestion of this metaphor is that it's sort of moving from something relatively gross, the walking fast, to something in a way more subtle. That's slightly imperfect metaphor, I think, but I think that's the idea behind it. So in a way, it's sort of, can we notice the subtle things that are keeping in place a recurrent thought when it occurs to us? And then if that doesn't work, then the final method that's suggested in this sutta is to clench our teeth and press our tongue against the roof of our mouth and beat down, crush and constrain this thought. And the analogy is given is just as a strong man might take hold of a weaker man by their neck, by their shoulders or by the head, and constrain, beat down, or crush that person so you can overcome your thoughts. Now, needless to say, I would recommend you use this one with great caution. I mean, I think actually sometimes there are times when we need to do that. You know, sometimes, for example, if we get flooded with anxiety, we maybe just have to sort of, as it were, white knuckle it as best we can. You know, even whilst the thoughts are going on, you know, even if we don't manage to completely beat them down or constrain them, we just have to, okay, it's almost like it is a fight in some ways, or it can be in certain situations. There are obviously other ways of working with anxiety too. But maybe there are times when we have to do that. But I also think, as I say, that there's a danger of taking this approach, which is that we just get into, again, this idea of, I've got to get rid of this thought, I can't have it. We develop aversion towards it, we put in too much effort, and it can have a whole set of negative consequences. However, I think there's another way that we can think about this idea, which is that, again, if we think of the analogy, it's of the Buddha describes as the stronger man against a weaker man. And I think what we can try and do is, in a way, surround that unhelpful, unskillful thought by something that is more skillful and wholesome. So we could think of surrounding the thought by metta, by loving kindness. So it's almost like holding that thought in a bigger field, in a bigger sort of pool of consciousness, in a way, in a stronger mindfulness. And certainly, you know, again, coming back to the example of anxiety, certainly for me, that is a much better way of working with anxiety, is just to recognize, okay, here we go. It's pretty unpleasant. I wish it wasn't happening, but it's happening. So I've got these anxious thoughts and feelings, but just holding them within a bigger sphere of awareness, a bigger sphere of kindness, of sympathy towards oneself in this situation. And that I find is a much, you know, more effective way of, and, you know, very useful way of working. So that's those 5 ways. I just want to mention one other way, which isn't in the sutras, which I think is helpful and may be implied but not explicit in these ways of working, which I think is quite important, which is what, in a way, we increasingly want to do is recognize our thoughts as thoughts. So they're just, if you like, stuff, mental phenomena, things that appear in our mind, that pop into our mind. What so easily happens is we identify with them and we confuse the thought on the one hand with the thing it refers to on the other. So we confuse the thought of a watch, for example, with this object here that I'm holding in my right hand, which of course is a watch. Now, that's less of a problem with watches, but when our thoughts go into, for example, judgments about ourselves, about other people, when particularly those judgments are, you know, colored by these sort of stories and narratives that I was talking about in the Honeyball Sutta, it's like then it's like the thought and what it points to gets stuck together. And what we want to do is, in a way, is to try and let them separate apart and be able to recognize thoughts as just thoughts. In other words, what I mean by that is learning to not take our thoughts so seriously. It's just stuff that appears in the mind. And even the ones where what they point to is or seems to be, and it's often a case of seems to be, true, even when that is the case, it's still a thought. It's a thought about whatever it is, maybe this terrible thing that's going on, but it's still a thought about it. It's not the thing itself. And if we can recognize that, it can start to loosen the power that these thoughts have. So that instead of feeding what's going on, it can start to weaken it and lessen it. It's bad enough that, if there is something objectively difficult that's going on, if that is the case, that's bad enough. But let's not make it worse by adding to it with all these thoughts about how terrible it is, how I can't stand it, how awful it is, this sort of thing shouldn't happen to me. All of those sort of thoughts which we sort of get glued to, that just creates and enhances our suffering. So what we can start to do is just see thoughts as just thoughts and not take them so seriously in that way, to sort of drop some of the identification with them, even the apparently truthful ones. Whether they're true or not actually doesn't matter. They're still thoughts. And we can, as we start to see this, we can let go of it. And then again, coming right back to where I started at the beginning, this thing of, thoughts will keep arising in our meditation. Well, actually, that's great, because it's a great opportunity to see that they're just thoughts. And in a way, all these different ways of working with thoughts can be ways to lead us to this point of recognizing thoughts are just thoughts. They're not things that we need to take too seriously. Thoughts are a very good servant. They're a terrible master. So we don't want to be controlled by our thoughts. We want to use our thoughts wisely and not be used by them. And that can really be helped by just understanding their nature, by seeing what they are. They're just mental phenomena. They're just thoughts. We don't need to take them seriously. And that can be a real gift when we really grasp that, through our practice of meditation, through our practice of observing our mind outside of meditation. When we can start to really understand that can make a real difference to our lives. Okay, so that's just, well, so we'll have questions in a moment. I'm just going to just finish off the suttas, just to sort of round off the story, as it were, or what happened. So at the end of this last sutta, the removal of distracting thoughts, the Buddha says that if one can practice these, if one becomes a master of the thoughts, then, you become called a master of courses of thoughts. In other words, you gain mastery over your thoughts, and you're able to think what you want to think and not think what you don't want to think. But it seems that you have to be pretty much enlightened by then. But that's quite a nice idea. The Buddha's able to do that. And at the end of the first sutta that I described, the Buddha says this: what should be done for disciples out of compassion by a teacher who has their welfare and compassion for them, that I have done. There are the roots of these roots of trees, these empty huts. Meditate. Do not delay, or else you will regret it later. This is my instruction to you. So yeah, the Buddha ends with a little exhortation to meditate. In other words, what's being said is, we need to really try and put all of this stuff into practice. Okay, so let's have some question and answers. So I'll ask David what questions we've got.
I guess first of all, Jane is just wondering, she's a bit unclear on what a sutta is, and what they are and how they fit in with the Buddha's teachings, or where to find Buddha's teachings in general. So just a bit of background. Okay,
that's great. So a question from Jane about what is a sutta and where does one find the Buddha's teachings? Okay, great. So a really good question. Originally, the Buddha just spoke. As far as we know, he didn't write. And for a couple of centuries at least, there was an oral tradition. So people remembered different things of what the Buddha said, and they recited it, and then they passed it on from teacher to disciple down the ages. At a certain point, they started writing down. And the different, if you like, little stories and teachings are called suttas in Pali. They're called sutras in Sanskrit. The fullest teachings written down that we have alive today, or we have available today, is in Pali, in the Pali suttas, of the early teachings of the Buddha. They were also transmitted in other languages, but the ones that have been kept alive are in Pali. And you can find them, well, I think we've given a website, access to insight.org, which has many of the Pali suttas. And if you're, there are various collections. There's a nice collection by Nyanamoli called Life of the Buddha, I think it's called, which has got a whole collection of suttas. If you want to start with something a bit shorter, one of the lovely ones that I love is the Dhammapada, which is like a collection of verses. So that's very nice. If you want to read something that's got more like stories, like I've been giving today, the Udana is a shorter one that, again, I really, really love. Okay, yeah.
A few more questions. Damien asks, is it normal for thoughts to not only fly to other places, but also constantly comment on the actual meditation? E.g., I'm getting better at this, that felt nice, I must remember this, etc.
Yeah. So question from Damien, is it normal for thoughts to fly all over the place? Yes. Is it normal for thoughts to find yourself commenting on what's going on? Absolutely. Yeah, we do that all the time. Or at least I do it, and it sounds like you do it. So that's two of us. But no, it's actually very, very common. And again, the thing to say here is that, some of that commentary can be quite useful. Now, some of our comments can take us away from meditation, or can be, we can have negative judgments, which are just unhelpful. But some of it can be quite useful to sort of notice, oh, so what's going on now? Okay, so I'm having a thought about that. Or I think an example you gave, Damien, was, this is quite nice. So you might notice this is quite nice. And then then you could ask yourself, oh, well, in what way is this nice? Can I feel that a bit more? So we can use our thinking to help guide us in our meditation, and that's very useful. Again, thoughts aren't all bad by any means. They're stuff that we can use.
Marcia asks, can you talk a bit more about applying the right amount of effort to watching thoughts?
Okay, so question from Marcia about the right kind of effort for watching thoughts. I mean, this is basically an ongoing thing that you're going to have in the whole of your meditation career. It's like, so this is just put it in perspective. It's like, we're constantly working with effort and finding what is the right amount of effort to apply. The Buddha gave the analogy of a lute and tuning a lute, and that if the strings are too tight, then it's not going to sound very good, and you may even break the strings. But if it's too slack, again, it won't sound very good. So you've got to get it at the right tension. Well, it's in a way, it's the same with applying the sort of effort in terms of noticing our thoughts. And so how do we know if we've got the right sort of attention, the right sort of effort, rather? Well, there's a couple of things we can do. One is we can notice the sort of mind states that we've got. So if everything feels very tense, then probably we are a bit too much effort. If, on the other hand, it all seems a bit sort of cloudy and fluffy and we're sort of floating all around the place in a rather sort of vague way, then probably we've not got enough effort. The other thing we can do is we can try and put in a bit more effort or put in a bit less effort and see what the effect of that is. Generally, more people, I would say, tend to put in too much effort than too little. So often just to back off and try and create a bigger space, try and let go, particularly if there's any tension in the body, can be more helpful in terms of the effort we need. But sometimes, and particularly, for some people, it's like a bit more effort is needed. So a bit more on the case of what is going on right now. So in a way, we could think of the putting more effort as to, definite direct question of what is going on right now. Whereas a little less effort would be maybe a bit more like just opening up the space and almost letting the awareness of what it is come to you. So it's that sort of thing. You can either you can move towards the object, the thought in this case, or you can, as it were, let it come to you. And again, you can play with that. And it might be, again, if your tendency, as so many people, is to put too much effort, then it might be just to try this thing of just letting go and letting it come to you. So letting it, in a way, reveal itself to you rather than you going chasing after it. Okay, what's our next one?
Oliver asked, what if you're a compulsive thinker or addicted to thinking, if this is possible? And whether it is possible to be addicted to thinking or not.
Right, okay, so nice question from Oliver about being addicted to thinking. Of course, that should be right up my street, as I used to be an addiction psychiatrist. I think what I would say about that is probably we're all addicted to thinking to some extent, in the sense that, well, a couple of things. One is that it's almost like the sea that we swim in. Our thinking is the sea that we swim in. And there's something very alluring, attractive about thinking. It's kind of like it's like our mind likes to do it. In a way, it's kind of like what our mind is designed to do. Our mind is designed to think. So that's what it will do. You know, we try and put our attention onto the breath, and guess what? Our mind will start thinking, because that's what minds like to do. So I think partly it's just the result of that's you know, one, it's very attractive. Two, it's what we're designed to do. But I think the other thing is that our identity gets very tied up with our thinking. It's like our thinking keeps telling us who we are, and even that we are. So, you know, particularly things like reminding ourselves obsessively about what we like and what we don't like. I like this, but I don't like that, and it'll be really nice to have this, but it wouldn't be nice to have that. You know, the sort of person I am, yeah, well, I'm the sort of person who da-da-da, I'm not the certain person who does that sort of thing. And even when we're thinking about other people, it's often in comparison to ourselves, as like, you know, I'm better or worse than them, or they're the sort of person that does that, but I, on the other hand, am the sort of person who does this sort of thing. Or, oh, I like that person because they do what I like to do, you know. So again, a lot of our thinking is to do with our identity. And I think because of that, it can actually be a bit, well, one, it has a strong grip on us, but also it can be a bit scary, the idea of letting go of thinking. In a way, it can be a bit threatening to our sense of self if we were to let go of thinking. So sometimes what can happen is that, you know, we're meditating and we're doing the business, so we pay focus on the breath, the mind goes off, we come back and we're doing this endlessly. And then maybe at a certain point, the mind actually, we get a bit deeper in the mind, and the mind goes a bit quiet. And sometimes what can happen is we go and go, oh, and it's like, oh, it's a bit scary. And I think it is this, you know, because that's what we're used to. And so it can feel a bit unnerving. You know, can we still exist, as it were, if we're not also thinking? So I think all those are part of, you know, I mean, I don't know that it would quite fit in the, you know, diagnostic criteria that I would use when I was a psychiatrist for an addiction as such. But nevertheless, loosely speaking, I think, you know, this can explain why we are sort of a bit addicted to thinking. And in a way, just to be patient with that and open to the possibility of, you know, there being other aspects to our experience that we can pay attention to, particularly the body. Okay.
Yeah, following on from that, Emma says she finds all of her thoughts are very strongly linked to her emotions. Even a little thought sends her off on extremes. Any help with dealing with the emotional side?
Yeah. Okay, great. So Emma's talked about thoughts being linked to emotions, which are actually, I mean, they, you know, thoughts and emotions are very, very closely tied up together. And, you know, what Emma's noticed, and well done for noticing, is that even a small or perhaps rather subtle thought can produce quite a big emotional response. So how do we work with our emotions? in a way, in some ways, it's the same ways as we you know, work with our thoughts. But I will say a couple of things specifically. Something that I alluded to at just at the end of talking about the thoughts is to the compulsive, obsessive, addictive thoughts, is to notice the body. So whenever we have an emotion, there will also be body sensations. So in order not to feed the emotion, which we do by thoughts, even small thoughts, as you've noticed, Emma, what we can do is try and move our attention onto the body and see how that, as it were, is being held in the body. Now, it might be quickly, immediately apparent. You know, for example, you're feeling anxious and you've got butterflies in the tummy. That would be an example, or that you notice you're sweating or your heart's racing or something like that. Sometimes the body sensations are not so obvious, and you might not be able to immediately identify a body sensation that's linked to the particular emotion. So what you can do then is just anyway notice what's going on in the body, and in a sense almost like don't worry about whether this physical sensation is definitely linked to this emotion. That might become apparent as you pay attention, or it might not. In a way, it doesn't matter. What we can just do is just feel whatever is going on in the body, and try and feel that. What we want to do is try and cultivate an atmosphere around that of interest, of curiosity, of even kindness, of just sort of allowing those sensations to be there. So we try as best we can to get interested in that. And the more that we can do that, it will take us out of, will sort of move us away from just having the emotion in our face, as it were, but also, more particularly, it'll take us out of the thoughts which feed the emotion. In a way, the emotion doesn't have to be a problem. Emotions, like everything else, are impermanent, and we can just let the emotion come and go, a bit like riding a wave, sort of riding a surf. We can think of it like that. We can just allow that, to be there. And in fact, a number of people struggle more with the fact of they don't have emotions, or they don't seem to have emotions, because they're so either blocked or so subtle they can't find them. So you've got emotions, that's great. So the thing is, in a way, just to let them be there, to ride them, and not to feed them, particularly if I'm assuming they're unhelpful emotions. If you suddenly find yourself with a big wave of compassion or metta, then of course you can feed that, you can let that grow, by all means. But if they're difficult emotions, then we can think of this riding them, but also particularly to notice the body sensations, pay attention there, stay there, and that can be a way of not feeding the emotion. Okay. Yeah.
A question from Isaac, who says, how do you recognize tendencies that are very well hidden that might be leading to repeated self-sabotage? Tendencies that are very well hidden in our blind spots and shadows.
Okay, great. So great question about how can we recognize hidden tendencies, so this thing of like that are holding things in place. Again, well, first I think it's just to acknowledge it can be tricky. Sometimes we don't know why something keeps appearing. Why we can have, for example, the example that was given here was a tendency to self-sabotage. So, specifically with that, in a way, one can work from two ends. So one can work from try and see what's leading to it, which was a question, which feeds in with what I said. But the other thing, and I'll come back to that in a moment, but the other thing is, in a way, just responding to it on its own terms. So when we self-sabotage, or when we catch ourselves maybe being about to self-sabotage, which is kind of better, it's always good if you can catch it beforehand, trying to bring in an attitude of kindness and metta towards that. And there can be different ways of doing that. So, in a way, whatever way that you find works for you. But one way that can work is to remember that actually it's not an uncommon problem. A lot of people do this, have this tendency to self-sabotage. And so we can remember that, we're not alone with this. And, particularly if we've seen somebody else do it, particularly where it's, if it's a friend. But if not, if we don't have that, maybe we can remember that other people who do that. Or could we imagine if we did have someone that we knew that was doing that who was a friend, what sort of response we'd have to that? Well, of course, we wouldn't want them to self-sabotage. We'd want them to look after themselves. So that can be a sort of way in to try and building that sort of metta towards ourselves to create that atmosphere of metta towards ourselves so that we don't feed and do this thing in terms of self-sabotaging. So that's going from one end. Going from the other end in terms of, what about the causes for it when we're not aware of the causes for it? Partly, I think it is just a thing of to just keep paying attention and to keep being curious. There's it's quite a well-known poem about, I can't remember what it's called now, something in 7 stages or something like that. But it's basically the idea is that, you walk down a road and you fall into a hole and you don't even know how you got into it. And then you keep doing that. But eventually you fall into a hole and you recognize, oh, here I'm in this hole again. And you climb slowly out of it. And then the next time you recognize faster, oh, I'm in this hole, and you climb out of it more quickly. And then the next time you actually get to the edge of the hole and you go, and you walk around it very carefully. And then the final time you choose a different street. So it's a bit like that with any sort of unhelpful habit. So, for example, like self-sabotaging is just really being interested in it, really being interested in trying to remember what happened before, trying to recognize it coming up, and sort of just paying more and more attention to that so that we start to really get to know the subtleties of that and how it comes about. And with that increased awareness, that in time will give us the choice to be able to respond differently. Okay, I think we'll have a quick question.
This is from Anna. Can you talk more about shifting attention to skillful thoughts, which is the opposite for illusion?
Okay, yeah, opposite of?
For illusion. Oh,
for illusion. Okay, yeah. So the question was, how do we? That's somebody's very. Who was it? Anna. Yes, you're very on the ball there. So that's very good. So how can you switch to positive for illusion or delusion? So what is the opposite of that? Well, what the Buddha says in the sutta is that you go and study with a teacher. So I think, in a way, what's being pointed at here is the importance of studying the Dharma. So the thing about delusion or spiritual ignorance or lack of clarity is that, in a way, we've got muddied thinking, and apart from clearing our minds a bit generally through having more skillful mental states, the clearer our mind, we'll be able to see more clearly, but also to study. So, read the Dharma, listen to talks, go to events like tonight. That will help to clarify one's mind. So that, and so that one can start to recognize where one's holding unhelpful views and start to be able to, in a way, challenge them, to be able to, in a way, put in place a more skillful or helpful view. So again, just to, in a way, just give an example of, if I've got a thought, which would be an example of illusion, but it's tied in this case with craving, as if I think, getting another African violet is going to make me really, really happy. I might actually bring some reflection on that mind and think, well, it might be nice for a moment, but that's only going to be impermanent. So that's not actually going to give me lasting satisfaction. So maybe that wouldn't be so good. But don't hold me to it. Okay, so we're at time now. So just to finish, so just to remind you that this week is continuing. So we've just been doing, the last 3 evenings have been doing the ethics. In the mornings, we're doing the meditation. So do come to the morning meditation. And tomorrow evening, we'll be starting with wisdom. So Surya Gupta will be giving a talk on wisdom tomorrow evening. So I hope you've enjoyed this evening. I hope I've got a little taste of the honey ball, and hopefully inspired, as the Buddha said, to go to those roots of trees or empty huts. Now, you might not be able to do that, but of course, we're here to help with that. And that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to make available the Dharma for anybody who wants the Dharma. And if you can support us in doing that, that would be really, really wonderful. We really rely on other people's generosity to help us keep going, particularly at this time when we can't be open physically. So if you can donate to the centre, £50 would be really, really good. If you can give more, that'd be even better. But any amount you can give would be really, really welcome. And you can do that through the link that Emily Odin is going to put on. Emily Odin, our fundraiser, is going to put on. So we'll just conclude finally with the transference of merits. So we'll do that in call and response. And I'll rely on people in the room to respond. Okay, good. May the merit gained.
May the merit gained.
In my acting thus.
In my acting thus.
Go to the alleviation of the suffering of all beings.
Go to the alleviation of the suffering of all beings.
My personality throughout my existences.
My personality throughout my existences.
My possessions.
My possessions.
And my merit in all 3 ways.
And my merit in all 3 ways.
I give up without regard to myself.
I give up without regard to myself.
For the benefit of all beings.
For the benefit of all beings.
Just as the earth and other elements.
Just as the earth and other elements.
Are serviceable in many ways.
Are serviceable in many ways.
To the infinite number of beings.
To the infinite number of beings.
Inhabiting limitless space.
Inhabiting limitless space.
So may I become.
So may I become.
That which maintains all beings.
That which maintains all beings.
Situated throughout space.
Situated throughout space.
So long as all have not attained.
So long as all have not attained.
To peace.